There is a valley in South Wales where you can drive for 20 minutes without passing a single inhabited building. The terraced houses are still there. The chapels are still there. The working men's clubs, the schools, the corner shops with their faded signs, all of it still there. The only thing missing is the people. When the coal industry that built these valleys collapsed across the 1980s and 1990s, it did not just close the pits. It removed the economic reason for the communities around the pits to exist. And in some of these valleys, the communities simply thinned and then vanished, leaving behind the physical infrastructure of a world that no longer had a population to inhabit it. Wales does abandonment differently from England. In England, abandoned places tend to be single buildings, single sites, single stories. In Wales, the abandonment is sometimes entire landscapes, entire economies, entire communities that built themselves around an industry and found themselves without a purpose when that industry left. In this video, we are counting down 12 creepy abandoned places in Wales that nobody talks about. Not the ruins that appear in the travel supplements, the places that the tourist board has not found a way to incorporate into the Visit Wales narrative. The asylum on the hillside, the nickel smelter in the national park, the military test range that is still test firing over the farms below it, the hospital complex that closed so fast the records did not follow the patients out of the door. Stay with me to the end, because number one is a place that has been empty for over a century, that sits in one of the most beautiful landscapes in Wales, and where the reason everyone left has never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who was not already on their way out. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. On a hillside above the market town of Denbigh in North Wales, the ruins of one of the largest Victorian asylums ever built in Britain look down over the Vale of Clwyd. The North Wales Hospital opened in 1848 and was designed to hold 200 patients. By the time it closed in 1995, it had processed tens of thousands. This channel covered Denbigh Asylum in the video on abandoned British asylums. It belongs in this Wales video too, because it represents something specific about Wales that England's abandoned asylums do not. Denbigh was a Welsh-speaking institution in a Welsh-speaking community. The patients who were admitted here, many of them Welsh speakers from the surrounding rural and coastal communities of North Wales, were processed through an institution in which the language of the documentation, the language of the medical records, the language of the official communication with families, was English. The Welsh language was present in the daily life of the wards, in the conversations between patients, and in the pastoral care provided by Welsh-speaking staff. It was largely absent from the official record of what happened to the Welsh people who were institutionalized here. The building has been left to decay since closure. Fires have damaged sections. Vandalism has stripped anything removable. Planning applications for redevelopment have been submitted and rejected across 3 decades. What belongs specifically in this Wales video is not just the abandonment of the building, but the abandonment of the records. The patient files from Denbigh, covering a century and a half of admissions of Welsh-speaking patients, are held across various archives, partially accessible, partially restricted, partially deteriorated past readability. A Welsh-speaking community's institutional psychiatric history, documented primarily in English, deteriorating in archives that were never designed to hold it indefinitely. In the village of Clydach, in the Swansea Valley, at the edge of what is now the Brecon Beacons National Park, the ruins of one of the largest nickel smelting operations in the world stand in a state of industrial dereliction that the national park designation of the surrounding landscape has done nothing to address. The Mond Nickel Works at Clydach opened in 1902 and at its peak employed thousands of workers processing nickel brought from Canada through the Swansea docks. The process of nickel smelting produced nickel carbonyl, one of the most toxic industrial chemicals in routine use, as well as sulfur dioxide, heavy metal particulates, and a range of other emissions that were released into the air of the Swansea Valley and the surrounding communities for nearly a century of continuous operation. The facility closed in 2009. The site has been partially cleared but not fully remediated. The ground beneath the former smelter contains levels of heavy metal contamination that environmental surveys have established, but that have not been the subject of comprehensive public health investigation in relation to the communities that lived adjacent to the facility for a century. The site sits at the edge of the Brecon Beacons, one of Wales's most promoted landscapes. The juxtaposition of a heavily contaminated former industrial site with one of Wales's national parks is not a juxtaposition that the Visit Wales promotional literature addresses directly. The workers who spent their careers in the Clydach smelter and their families who lived in the communities around it have not been the subject of a comprehensive long-term health study. The nickel carbonyl that the facility produced was so toxic that a single exposure could kill in 3 to 5 days. The workers who were exposed to it across decades of employment have not had the health consequences of that exposure systematically investigated. On the mined Epynt plateau in Powys, between Brecon and Builth Wells, approximately 54 farms and their associated communities were compulsorily evacuated in 1940 to make way for the Sennybridge training area, the military exercise ground that still operates today. The evacuation of Epynt was conducted with a speed and a lack of compensation that, in the account of the families who were displaced, amounted to a deliberate act of cultural as well as physical displacement. The Epynt Plateau had been a Welsh-speaking community of independent hill farmers for centuries. The farms on the mountain were not wealthy, but they were viable, their families rooted in the landscape across many generations. The military requisition removed all of this in a matter of months. The families were given notice and dispersed to other parts of Powys and beyond. The farmhouses and outbuildings were used for military training, a purpose for which built structures in a rural landscape are particularly convenient. Many were demolished as part of training exercises. The Welsh language lost another of its rural communities, a community in which Welsh was the language of daily life, of farming, of chapel, of social interaction. The Sennybridge training area is still active. Live firing takes place on ranges that cover much of the former farming community's land. The farmhouses that survived the military use are roofless ruins in the landscape of the training area. The families who were evacuated in 1940 were told they would be able to return after the war. They were not. The pattern of Imber and Tyneham in England was repeated in Wales, but with the additional dimension that the community displaced was a Welsh-speaking one, and the loss was cultural and linguistic as well as physical. In the upper Rhondda Fach Valley in Rhondda above the last inhabited settlements, the remains of communities that supported the coal mining industry at the height of its production in the early 20th century are visible in the hillsides. Terraced rows that once housed mining families, the foundations of chapels, the earthwork remains of community buildings, the physical mark of communities that existed for a generation or two and then became unviable when the specific collieries they served closed. These are not the famous Rhondda communities whose decline was documented and mourned. They are the communities above and beyond those communities. The overflow settlements built when the Rhondda valleys were producing at maximum capacity, and every hillside that could carry a terrace did. When the capacity collapsed, these upper valley communities went first. The infrastructure of roads and services that connected them to the main valley was inadequate for the modern world. The houses were harder to heat, harder to maintain, harder to sell. The residents who could move to better connected parts of the valley did. The houses were not demolished. They were left. Some were used for agricultural storage, some were vandalized, some simply stood until the roofs collapsed and the walls began to follow. The Wales that is visible in the upper Rhondda Fach is a Wales that does not appear in the Visit Wales materials. It does not appear in the heritage tours. It does not appear in the dark tourism literature. It exists in the hillsides above the inhabited valley for anyone who walks high enough to find it, and it tells a story about the specific speed and completeness of the collapse of the South Wales coal economy that the exhibitions in the Big Pit Museum cannot quite replicate. In the forest above the Rhondda Valley, accessed by a single-track road through commercial forestry, the medieval church of St. Gwynno at Llanwynno sits in a clearing that feels, in almost all weathers, like a place that time has genuinely passed over. The church is not abandoned. It is maintained, occasionally used for services, and cared for by a small congregation and a heritage organisation. But it sits in a landscape that was Welsh-speaking farmland until the commercial forestry that now surrounds it replaced the community that had worshipped here. The churchyard contains the grave of Guto Naeth Bran, the legendary 18th century Welsh runner whose extraordinary speed across the mountains of the Rhondda made him a figure of local mythology. The church itself dates to the medieval period. The surrounding farmland that gave the church its community has been replaced by conifers that block the views, absorb the light, and create the specific atmosphere of a place that has been separated from the landscape it was built for. What belongs in this video is not the church itself, but what surrounds it. The commercial forestry that now covers the hillsides between Llanwynno and the Rhondda Valley below was planted in the 20th century on land that was Welsh-speaking farmland. The planting of commercial conifers across Welsh upland landscapes is one of the most significant transformations of Welsh countryside in the 20th century, carried out by the Forestry Commission in pursuit of timber production targets without adequate consideration of the Welsh-speaking farming communities that the plantations displaced, the landscape character that the planting destroyed, or the ecological value of the upland habitats that the conifers replaced. In the village of Aberfan in Merthyr Tydfil, this channel has already discussed the 1966 disaster in which 116 children and 28 adults died when a colliery spoil tip collapsed onto Pantglas Junior School. The memorial garden, the white headstones in the cemetery, the history of the National Coal Board's negligence, and the subsequent financial injustice to the community are documented in the Aberfan video. What belongs in this Wales video is a different and less visited dimension of the Aberfan story. The Merthyr Tydfil Mining Institute and the physical legacy of the coal industry's cultural infrastructure in the communities it built and then abandoned. The Working Men's Institutes and Miners' Welfare Halls of South Wales were one of the most significant cultural investments that the coal economy made in its workforce. Libraries, reading rooms, lecture halls, music halls, swimming pools, built by contributions from miners' wages and managed by the communities themselves. Many of these buildings are now derelict. The institutes that serve the South Wales coalfield communities represent one of the most significant concentrations of Edwardian and interwar public architecture in Britain, most of it listed, most of it deteriorating, all of it representing a specific form of working-class cultural investment that the communities that created it no longer have the economic base to maintain. The Rhondda Heritage Park, the Big Pit, the Valley's Regional Park, have found ways to incorporate aspects of this heritage into their tourism offer. The majority of the miners' institutes are still there, in the streets of the communities that built them, deteriorating. On the shore of a lake called Trawsfynydd Nuclear in North Wales, a decommissioned nuclear power station sits in a landscape that, but for its presence, would be one of the most beautiful in Wales. Trawsfynydd Nuclear Power Station was built between 1959 and 1965 and was the first inland nuclear power station in Britain, the only one built on a freshwater lake rather than a coastal site. It operated until 1991, when it was shut down for maintenance and never returned to operation. The decommissioning process began in the 1990s and is expected to continue until at least 2083. The lake that cools the reactor, Trawsfynydd, is an artificial lake created in the 1920s for a hydroelectric scheme. The nuclear station used the lake for cooling water for its entire operational life. The discharge of slightly warmed water into the lake created conditions that affected the lake's ecology in ways that are documented but disputed in terms of their long-term significance.